batia 4 horas de manhã, 4 horas de tarde. Comecei a sentir que a bola fazia realmente uma curva de 2 metros, 2,5 metros.
Welcome to the 94th episode of Folha Today we're joined by Klaus Thompson, CEO of the Danish League, the governing body that oversees Danish League football. Klaus, welcome to Folha.
Thank you very much.
You were a director at Ramble Management Consulting, a sustainability-driven advisory firm, before moving to the football industry. What value does a consultancy background offer to a football league CEO?
It offered, apart from some specific competence in that, one of my areas of industry was the media industry, and media rights contracts and media rights agreement is a big thing of running a league. It's the economic foundation of most leagues and their operations. So that's one part of it. I also had the responsibility for a center for experience economy. So I've been dealing with sports, media, other sorts of entertainment and experiences in that sense. And then a lot of the work in general of what we do, apart from it's not much use to have that background if we're talking competition planning, things like that. We have good people who are competent in that field, but a lot of the work is development projects and seeing how we can push things forward and what's the strategy, what's the analysis of the situation, what will actually create value for Danish football in terms of common investments, in terms of initiatives of forwarding particular developments in clubs or in football. So and that is a lot of what you do in management consulting as well. So I think the background is not a bad one, but I will leave that for other people to judge whether I've done a decent job with that background.
Does it help you in any way to go through a checklist when you need to do a due diligence, to conduct a due diligence when you arrive to a new organization?
Oh, yes, certainly. Also because the Danish league, when I started back in 2007, and tragically the former CEO fell ill and died, and the organization had been laying still, so to speak, for a couple of years. So it has been a long journey of development, and it has been a long journey where we developed from being a small organization, basically handling media rights, few other things, to a full-fledged league organization where we're operating every aspect of the top 4 tiers of Danish football. And that includes the sporting side. That includes that we are heavily involved in talent development. It includes the common digital investments, and the latest thing we've launched is that the league is now owning 50% of a joint venture of a TV production company. So we do this, and that gives us also a big platform of a tech platform that no single club can access, and it seems to will give us a severe lift in digitization, both on the sporting side and on the business side of the league organization. So yes, I would say it's a good set of competence and skills, a good skill set to show up with.
We will that's a great point. We will get into more depth on that one, because it's really important in the way you run the leagues. Since you joined the Danish league in 2007, the Superliga's format has evolved quite a bit. We saw the 2016 expansion from 12 to 14 teams, and then the 2020 return to 12 teams. That gave us today's setup, right? So a 22 match regular season then splitting into a top six and bottom six. Is this the definitive format while you're in charge, or what may trigger further changes?
Hmm. The clubs were wise enough that when we did when we first ventured into to developing a new format, we went away from the traditional round robin competition. They were wise enough to say that this was a definitive, or when we went back to from 14 to 12 teams and the present format, they were wise enough to say that this has to be a long-term agreement. So it's a set agreement until 31. Whether that will end up being the last competition format we have is while I'm there is hard to say. Um, it will the discussion will be put on the table whether we should be more than 12 teams. Every indicator when we went from 12 to 14 teams showed that it was a wrong decision. Changing the format was the right decision. Expanding the league was at that point the wrong decisions, and we lost a lot of exclusivity, a lot of attention. And there's only 6 million people in Denmark, so 12 clubs of the highest quality is actually a lot. Um, but it will be, I think, a discussion as we approach. Have things changed? Have things evolved? Has the infrastructure evolved? Has the level of the clubs evolved to a point where where we could be more teams? But it's a it's a thing you have to be very careful if you venture in there, because the thing is not just that you expanded with two teams. The thing is, if you expand with two teams, you add more than 30% extra matches, and is the market both sporting wise and commercially ready for that? Because it's not just the two teams; it's the number of matches of the top league which increases drastically. And I think that was the thing we did not anticipate the first time round. But so that's not cutting a long story short. But the answer is it will be discussed, but whether it will be changed, we do not know, or we will stay with the 12. I'd say the weakness of it right now, and some clubs will agree, some clubs will disagree, is that 32 matches for all clubs is a bit low. It's a bit low to run a full professional football club and then have basically 16 home games in a season plus the cup, and then if you're lucky, the Europe. It's no big deal if you're in Europe, but not everyone is. So I think that's one of the things that could be discussed as well.
You were mentioning the expanded domestic calendar with more matches, but maybe the problem, Klaus, I wonder if it's to have more matches or to make those additional matches just like trying to make it in such a way that top clubs can play against each other, which seems to be a bit the request of the broadcasters, right? Like it seems that they want to have more matches, but like with mainly between top teams.
The broadcasters does not wish for many more matches. I would say if you know, and that's why they do not wish for 30% expansion of matches. It's expensive. It takes up a lot of space. The problem is the quality, is the exclusivity, is the attraction there. So it's not broadcaster driven, that part of it. That part of it is really club driven, especially also because we've had a great success the last 5 6 years in with a good rise in the average attendance of spectators, and from being a country where we were, we've always economically performed. We've always been among the best in class if we're measuring on, if we're measuring compared to the size of population. We've been, sponsor-wise and commercially, we've been very good. Broadcast, media rights deals compared to the size of the population, we've been very good. But match day income has been low, but that has changed with clubs with a much more active club engagement in marketing and digitization in the area, and so from being a not so important source of income, it has become more important. So, and you can say, if you so one of the things that can increase sustainability is a couple of more home matches every season, and so that would be the reason to do it. Does it have to be? I think broadcasters are perfectly happy with the top 6 setup we have right now. Actually, that has performed very well for them. It has also performed very well for the clubs. Yeah, and it has given the unpredictability back to the competition, the competition format we have right now.
And is consistently ranking within UEFA's top 10 coefficients the definitive objective for the Superliga, or is the focus elsewhere?
It depends who you're speaking to. You're speaking to the CEO of the league now. So my objective is for the league to be so successful at all. Like, if we could increase spectator numbers with 30% more, that would be the aim. But aside from that, our position in the European ranking right now is probably 1 or 2 places lower than it ought to be. So I would say, compared to the overall economy of Denmark as a country and the Superliga as a competition, yes, we should aim to climb a couple of places. And number 10 is a nice target to have, but it's nice to have ambition, but the realistic point is we should at least be a couple of places higher up and have some more stability in our. We're lacking stability in the European performance.
And the primary focus of any league, of course, is to refine its product, right? Like elevating both on-pitch performance and broadcast quality. What measures and innovations has the league introduced recently to achieve this?
We're coming to the end of a strategy we did back in 2017, where we set 3 major goals. One was to renew the format. We did that to make a big change. The other one, and which has been extremely successful, was that we would make an effort to strengthen club talent development, and as a basis of a club and league operation, and making it sustainable that way. And we were not very good at it at that time, but all the clubs bought into it. And I think from we launched that effort in 17-18 till now, I think investments in talent development and academies in the club is times 7 of what it was then. But it has also then placed Denmark as country number 10 in the world in terms of transfer income, which is rather absurd if you think of Denmark as a country with 6 million people. I think Portugal is better in this, but not many other places. So we've been extremely successful in doing that. The last point was that we would have to go to strengthen the effort to have a common commercial infrastructure or backbone or framework for clubs to operate within. The production company is one part of that. The other part is a digital investment strategy we've had with a common ticketing database, which can do different things. It can, it can allow clubs to benchmark. Everyone has to use we do not have one ticketing system. We could not make that work because ticketing systems are so integrated with all other barter agreements with clubs and all the rest of it. So if you try to buy one, it becomes much more expensive in total, which it shouldn't, but it does. But what we did instead was that we have a standard and specifications and a certification you as a ticketing system supplier must adhere to become a supplier to league clubs. Now that travels into a common ticketing database, which allows all clubs to benchmark and all clubs to benchmark, how all the systems, how do they handle it? How does different segments on the stadiums develop? Who's good at doing what? Who's good at handling no-shows, which is becoming the biggest issue for the clubs in the ticketing side. And all these methods, and that and other digital investments. We're looking at common, at tools for marketing, automation, all sorts of other things that have become extremely important. And then there's also always sustaining the experience of football matches as being intense, entertaining, rivalries, but safe events to go to. So we have invested a lot in safety measures, and we are, by and large, we have very little trouble related to the matches, and it's extremely important. But also there we do common investment. We've just introduced a facial recognition system in all stadiums across the league as part of this. So all these things are what we're doing to try and push forward. We're going to try and see, can we do the next push on talent development as well? Actually, that's a strategy we're developing now, and we're going to see, being not in all modesty, we're going to see if we can become the number one country in the world with AI-assisted talent development and execution of licensing systems and these things, and set a new standard. See if we can move into a new generation of this. So that's part of, it's a large portfolio. And apart from that, there's something I have to mention, which is a bit boring, but very, but does give us a competitive edge. And that is that we have very strict and good and reliable labor market regulations of what's taking place. We have a collective bargaining agreement with the players' union. We're in complete agreement of executing it in a number of areas, which has given Denmark a reputation of you will get what you signed up for in your contract, which is, in a global world for many football players, actually makes that's very attractive, that we can sort of like, you can look anyone in the eye and a player can call another player from his country, if it's an international player, and say, did you get what they promised you? And he will always get a yes, and we can also always promise that if players are not given what they're supposed to have in relation to their contracts, we will enforce that will be the case. And it's often overlooked, but it's a big asset in the sharp competition for where do skillful talent travel to, for instance.
Before addressing also the safety issue that you were mentioning,
Mm.
still in terms of talent development, is there anything that you can also include when it comes to looking back, like when you arrived to the Danish league, like in terms of strategy and support that you've been providing to clubs throughout the years? What looking back, what do you see as really effective and that was really important for Denmark to be some of the country of reference in what regards to that area? And also, when you were saying that you want to arrive and to achieve the number one position in terms of, if I understood correctly, AI assisted talent development, if you could
Yes.
also elaborate on that.
The last point will be guesswork, but because we're starting the process. But um, what we did back then, one thing is you need consensus among the clubs that something must be done, and there is a consensus that we must all do something, because also with if you're talking a country the size of Denmark and clubs the size we have here, no club is big enough to have a an environment of or sort of like a set of competences and an environment where they can develop within itself. There will simply never be enough people in a department so they can have a strong development setup or innovative without exchanging with others. So you need and you also need to realize that people with all the specialist with the specialist skills will travel around the different clubs. So first of all, you will have to have the consensus that everyone needs to be on board, and they need to be on board for the right reason, or for two reasons. One, it's probably a good thing. Two, you're missing out if you're not part of it. And but what we specifically then did was that all clubs agreed that Double Pass, the Belgium consultancy slash research company, would run through every single club, top to bottom, on talent development, and go through, and all that was compiled. All clubs were benchmarked up against each other. Um, and on top of that, we built a talent development strategy which targeted a number of areas. But the first exercise is extremely important because it gives a common language. It's not just because double pass is good, but they are and skillful, but it's because it gave, it set the whole industry or the whole sporting environment in Denmark on the same page, gave them a similar language, made them able to compare each other, know who was good at what, and then move from there. And then investments move very rapidly. And what we've then been developing, we've target different areas as well. Transition obviously is always one of the important ones. How do you do that? But mental areas, physical areas. We've built specialist networks. We have a collaboration with the university, and within that, we've built, a network of uh, physical experts, of mental experts, of medical experts, of performance analysis experts that works with each other and exchange knowledge throughout the year. So we pushed on all these areas, but we have also in the second generation made the effort of consulting every single club on what would you say yourself were your specific needs, and then we've co-financed that as well. Everything has always been co-financed. We've given we pay a third or 50% from central funding, and the clubs put down the rest, which is also essential because you have to put your hand on the stove. Would be is a Danish expression if you want something to happen. So I'd say that that's some of the issues, but creating this common language and the sense of urgency that we do something and being able to benchmark, and then we moved very rapidly from there.
And correct me if I'm wrong or if I'm not being too precise, but it seems
Mm.
that the Superliga is also benefiting from a post-Brexit sweet spot, like being by holding a more favorable band ranking than other Scandinavian countries, which seems to make, like, your players a more straightforward option for English clubs to get work permits. My question is, if has the league capitalized this strategic bureaucracy to attract global talents who can see Denmark as the ultimate bridge to the Premier League?
No, I don't think so, to be honest. I've never heard anyone mention that as being. We are good bridge to the Premier League, but that is because the players that come out are well educated, and also that we are we've always been thinking globally. We like we do like Danish talent to be developed, but talent development has never been targeted just to develop Danish talent. It has been targeted to develop talent in Denmark. So in that, and we've always had in the league it varies between 30 and 55% of international players in terms of minutes of league games played. So we have a long tradition of managing multi-ethnical squads also on the talent side. And rather, I think that that's part of the issues, because that of if we are exporting more than we are having more transfers than the other Scandinavian countries, but that is due to the general quality of what we're doing, really. And then that we do have a global we're born with a global outlook, which is maybe a bit without, I won't speak on behalf of the Swedes, but it may be different than what you would find in Sweden.
And Aniver, like, as far as I know, and again, I invite you to correct me if I'm wrong. Denmark seems to have a flat tax rate for high income foreign professionals, which may act as an important vehicle for attracting elite talent. Given that, of
Yes.
course, like, standard tax brackets would make it exceedingly much more difficult to compete. Is lobbying or the government to keep this tax rate necessary?
Hmm. Not to a large extent, because it's not this tax exemption is not targeted towards sports as such. It's targeted towards experts, and over the year, expert labor, international expert labor, and it's true there's a there is a tax break. But if you are, but it is on a relatively high salary. You need to. I think we're up in 15,000. You need to have a salary above 15,000 euros a month or something like that, which is not a lot for Cristiano Ronaldo, but for for an average talented player, it's a fairly high wage. So you have to be above that. But it is a general tax exemption that are given to all sorts of experts, which could be engineers in different fields or things like that. Over the years, but that was rather in the early phases. We have had to lobby for football players to be considered experts. which I think is to be honest, and I think that's what we managed to communicate, that is perfectly fair to say something like that, because just because we're not talking a verbal or an intellectual skill set, it is actually a highly specialized skill set that are highly valued, and and you can have a look at transfers in general among clubs, which illustrates it. So it is expert labor that clubs benefit, and does help club developing, does help developing professional football. So that's the kind of lobbying we've had to do. There is only that one tax scheme, but it has worked well for us. It has, not just for talent, also for
Yeah.
more experienced players.
Yeah, because maybe it has changed in the meantime, but as far as I saw, it was like 10K a month, which basically for professional football, top level Danish football seems to be quite accessible, right, for clubs.
Yeah, it is quite accessible.
Yeah.
It is quite accessible. So many international players in clubs benefit from this.
Yeah. And
So it's been a good thing, but it's a general tax scheme. It's not targeted towards football actually.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And we've had, as you say, did you have to lobby? Yes, we had to defend that we were part of this scheme, but we've been managed to do so far.
Yeah. Taking back the subject of safety and automated facial recognition, although you want matches to be exciting, like this is the reason why you also back, for instance, safe alternatives such as cold flares, let's say. Of course, you still need to keep troublemakers out of stadiums.
Hmm.
Is it manageable to untangle risk from the stadium experience? I mean, to find the optimal point between safety and let's say, entertainment, or is it much harder than people think?
Hmm. The hard, it's not hard in the sense that all we actually do is to say, apart from interfering with what goes on the pitch, most of our regulations is actually you have to be within Danish law. And the biggest issue, uh, we have other issues, but the biggest issue is pyrotechnics. We tried to back the cold flare. The cold flare was then categorized as something it wasn't legal anyway to use in a stadium. So uh, it didn't go anywhere, but we actually co-financed to see if we can do a development of that. Um, uh, and then there's the pyrotechnics and laws around pyrotechnics is that you're allowed to use it on New Year's Eve and New Year's Day, and that's it. Otherwise, you have to have a specific permit from the authorities. So we have an issue with it because it's a culture, and it's a big culture in Denmark, and it's a culture of, I don't know, independence and identity, or what. But there are two issues with it. One, it's illegal, but two, and most important, it is dangerous. Flares are more than 600 degrees warm, and that's why you'll never get a permit from the head of the fire department in any municipality to burn such a thing in a crowd. We're trying to work with that, but I wouldn't say it's not difficult to find the boundaries. It's good to always, because violence and things like that are unacceptable, and and we have a zero tolerance culture for it, and you should have, because it's the biggest risk you could have as a league. I know is that all of a sudden you slip with security, and that's a very slippery slope, and it's fast once you get on it. Um, so it's really important to handle. It's really important to have an extensive dialogue with fans. And the dialogue with fans is something the clubs will handle. It's always difficult because the fans you would like to have a dialogue with, there are the official fan sections, and you can have a dialogue with them, but there are some of the unofficial ones, and that's difficult to have a dialogue. And but we try, and then there's a very small group, but that's, my best guess is it's a group of 200 or 300 people in Denmark or something that are completely inaccessible, and for that we will need other measures and work continuously and work with the culture of it. But I think we're managing well, and I also think, as big a degree of liberty and all the rest of it in the stands is nice. And the facial recognition actually is part of the strategy of not in of, believe it or not, of registering fewer fans and and intervening less, if you may, because what the facial recognition system does is it does not register anyone at any point, but it can find people who are registered as having a stadium band. So that's what it can do. But it doesn't. We do not. When you pass, it will take your biometric data, and once you've entered, it will forget your biometric data will go away. And that was, and so to speak, the only fans we're bothering with this are the ones who are banned from going into the stadium. And we've been successful with the fans in having the dialogue about this, and there's a good acceptance among the fans in Denmark of this, and they think it's the right way to go as well, because it targets the ones that are banned from going to the stadium and no one else.
Currently, when one discusses football business, one can't avoid speaking about sports betting, I would say, as it is actually a massive revenue driver, which nonetheless poses some risks, as we know. Denmark is often seen as a model of regulation, largely due to your long-standing tradition of state regulated responsible betting. But as match fixing remains a growing threat to mid sized leagues, how do you practically safeguard the Superliga's integrity by ensuring the threat doesn't evolve faster than your regulations?
Hmm. We do a lot of things. We have all the standard or non-standard monitoring tools in place. That will monitor and detect different betting patterns on on different matches. Uh, in our case, for the top 4 tiers, um, and licensed betting operators in Denmark has to contribute to that. But that doesn't. There could be a betting operator in Hong Kong who bet on Danish matches for that reason, and you can have. So, but we have the monitoring of that, and then we have a very strict set of rules for players, for sporting personnel, for administrative personnel. For me, I'm not allowed to bet on a football match. It should give itself, but of course I'm not allowed to bet on a football match. So we have a very and we have a high enforcement on investigation if there is any suspicious patterns anywhere. Apart from that, and what I think is much more important, we do have a continuous effort to educate players and sporting personnel in all clubs uh, on the risks, on the risk factors, what you have to be aware of, where the dangers are with that, how you monitor it, and we have sort of like an iteration uh, of a roadshow that travels to educate the sporting sector in these matters, and then we collaborate across sports. So far, we've only have minor minor incidents. We've been spared for major incidents, but it's a risk. But I do believe that education is, monitoring is important. Education is much more important in this area, and also educating players in the risk that they take, because mid-sized leagues, of course, and especially the one with the Danish one, with a high share of international players, uh, is is at high risk because they might have friends or whatever, bad friends, so somewhere else that will try to influence them. So education, and also education in the risk and how riskful this can be for your career as a football player. Yeah, I think that is the more important thing. Also, educating clubs and clubs personnel around players and others. What are the risk factors? What should you look out for?
And when it comes, of course, one should also always mention the TV broadcast rights. You secured the recent deal in 2023, your
Mhm.
current 6-year broadcasting deal, meaning it will run until 2029, 2030, which is projected to generate between 53 and 67 million euros annually, which marks a significant 30 to 40% increase. Given that this growth diverges from the declining trends we've been seeing across several other main European markets, what made this deal possible is the first part of my question. And in retrospect, where would you see room for even further improvements in the future?
Um, First of all, I'm not sure improvement. We should have a steady growth, but improvement is not the when we are at the level that we are at. Stability is more important than improvement. Or sort of like seeking the next jump. And that's what we obtained with the deal, with the 6-year deals until 2030. The reason that we could do this is, first of all, we have a very long relationship with the broadcasters, especially Viaplay, who's been with us for almost 25 years now, and who has helped develop the league as such, as a strategic media asset, by investing in the product all along. Um, and TV2 is the other strong sports broadcaster in Denmark. So these two partners, and to be able to develop stable partnerships over the years, that also shows that you can monetize the rights in the market, because that's ultimately what will give you, unless you have a very specific competitive situation, which you can always wish for, but not can be ensured. Then the proof of the capacity to monetize the rights is what media rights holders will be looking for, or companies, what the broadcasters will be looking for. And we have that. And the other thing we have is we have a very mature commercial media market in Denmark, and we have had, and we were early in developing that industry. So, and that's not the leagues doing. That's just pure luck, to be honest. Where you can sit in somewhere else where commercial television, which is what will always hold, top premium football rights, is less developed. That's just a hard sell, to be honest. So I think, and then apart the also, we've always partnered with our broadcasters in developing the product. We've always been extremely conscious. We have two competitors. One is the Premier League, two is the Champions League. The Superliga right is the biggest and most expensive ones, and the ones moves the most subscriptions in the market, so to speak. So it's the more valuable one, but we compete with the two others. That demands two things of us. First of all, a quality that is higher than what it you would what you would suspect it would be in a league the size of the Danish one. I've seen leagues saying, let's save money on production because that will give us a greater income from the media rights, and that is an extremely uh, hazardous road to travel down. I would say I would never do that because we are competing with the two other ones. The other one is, our unique selling point, or what we have that the two others do not have, is that we are close. We are the competition for people who lives in Denmark. You can see it, you can watch it, you can go out there, smell the grass, but we are also extremely conscious of it when we deliver a match. There are always interviews with the coaches just before kickoff, like 20 seconds, 30 seconds before. There's interviews with assistant kickoffs during match. We go extremely close into the whole operation and the storytelling. So we make sure that it's much closer, and you can get a closer look into. It's not just these million euro stars performing on the pitch that you have a certain distance to. So we're extremely conscious that we have on one side a product that matches in quality, but then the other side goes much deeper and much gives you a closer look into to the match itself.
You wouldn't position, for instance, La Liga, Italy Serie A, Ligue 1, as also competitors?
No, not in the media rights picture. They are, but Scandinavia is different than the rest of Europe in the sense that both the Premier League and the Champions League are extremely popular and extremely high valued. And we're talking that there were, last time round, as far as I've heard, there was a 40% drop in income from media rights for the Champions League or for the European club competitions in the Nordic territory. But the Nordic territory still remains the sixth largest right in for the European club competitions overall. And the reason for the drop was that they had a very special competitive situation the last time round. But so we're very high up there. But no, La Liga, Serie A, and the Bundesliga, are fantastic competitions of a high quality, but they are second or third tier rights in the Danish market. They are rather third tier rights, third or fourth tier rights than it is the two others that are competitors. Then there's the Formula One. Then there is the Tour de France, who's extremely popular, but that's only 1.5 months. So that's so actually our rights are extremely uh, important to put at the end of the Tour de France, so there's not too much churn from the subscribers that subscribe to see the Tour de France. So yeah. So no, the answer is no. It's third or fourth tier rights in a Danish context.
And still on this subject, Klaus, Danish football has consistently resisted the individual sale of broadcasting rights, as I believe you already mentioned, right? Like everything is passes through a collective model. So
Yes.
one part of my question is if throughout the years, if there has been any kind of pressure from elite clubs, elite domestic clubs, to depart from this centralized approach in favor of a more individualized system. And the second part would be taking back of what you already mentioned. In 2023, the Danish league launched matchday production that took you full TV production control away from the external providers, broadcasters, sorry.
Mm.
So in practical terms, what has been the impact of these and the reasoning behind this? So these two parts of the question.
What was the first one?
The first
I
one
forget.
was the top, the elite clubs maybe
Oh, yeah, yeah,
putting
yeah.
some pressure.
Before we made the deal until 31, which we did back in 18, that said, and that deal also sets the distribution agreements. We would have to negotiate a distribution agreement among clubs before we went to market with our rights every time. That's the most difficult exercise you could ever imagine. You can just think of what club would say yes to have potentially less than they did from the agreement before. And there's always been pressure there from bigger clubs, saying if we're not giving a substantial part or sufficient part of the distribution potentially, then we might leave the agreements. But we manage to negotiate this every time. There was a club who stepped out at one point. It took 3 months and they stepped back in. Part of the reason for that is that one of the things that Danish football is based on is a very broad base of football is a big culture, and remember we are we are 6 million people. With the federation alone, there are 400,000 registered football players, and there are 2 more organizations who organizes football as well. But apart from that, every league club must play on a mother club license to participate in the league, because we it's the Danish FA that owns the competitions ultimately. But also when I describe the whole talent development system, all this is extremely valuable to all clubs. So stepping out of that, because if you're stepping out of the commercial agreement, you will also, rest of football will also think, if you will not contribute in that part, you will be less attractive to include in the rest of it. So so in that sense, the ecosystem is much larger than just those agreements. So we're facing difficulties keeping it together every time, but we managed to do so far. So that's one thing. And then there's match day production. Why did we do that? We did it for a number of reasons. One was the reason that one was the reason that I just mentioned, that it is extremely important for us to secure and maintain quality of the productions. And with matchday production, we control the production quality, basically, so we can ensure that it is always where it needs to be to be sufficient good for the competition. That's one thing. The other thing is that we are in an extremely volatile media market that goes up and down. So we have absolutely no idea if there's any competition next time we go to market, if we need to do whatever. But of course, it enabled us. We are plug and play for a new player in the Danish media market, for instance. It's all you have to do is engage a few journalists and set it up, and you're in business, basically, if you want to. It's also an option that we can go OTT, but there is no. But that is only a last resort, because there's no decent business case for OTT. You said, as you rightly said, we take down around 60 million euros a year. And I think the French league now, with 1 million subscribers, take about 100 million for the clubs in France. So it's a 1 million subscribers in Denmark would mean that we had 75% of all households or something like that paying for a singular product, not a bundled product with something else. So the business case is not that. But if it ends up like that, we have the capacity. We already built it. Then there's the issue of the tech platform that we achieve here, because the match day production is a state of the art and it's a next generation production technology. So it's not based on OB vans. It's based on a contribution network, a fiber optic network that connects, and I think, and we connect more and more venues. But right now, it's above 60 connected venues around Denmark that are part of a fiber optic ring. So we, so to speak, just drive not the OB van and do the production out there. We drive trucks out with cameras, and then we do centralized production in one venue, which is the next generation. Now that also provides a tech platform that we would never individually as clubs or as the league be able to invest in, and allows us to up digitization all the way around from this. And then there's a fourth, and which is a more cultural one, which is, it is, although it can seem irrational, it is important that there is also a material asset that binds clubs and the league together. You know, that it's not just immaterial rights, but that it's also a material asset that we have this company and can do different things with it. And then, of course, we also hope to make some money, but it takes a few years to recoup the investment. So that's a couple of years out.
No, it's really clear. Apart from, of course, gives you also more freedom to then to engage with fans, having images
Yes,
like read in the, and
it
like
it does. Just to illustrate it, you know, we've just no, we a year ago or something, we have we have introduced Magnify, so we have AI editing of and we have a common media asset management system which has every single picture a club could want for in the best quality available, always, instantly. And we can induce these things, and we are also starting to say, what can we do for clubs, what are specialized products. We have FC Midtjylland, for instance, has a very high percentage of business clients at their matches, and they have wished for a special TV production to be shown in lounges, an exclusive TV production in match, doing different things. And we can do that and edit it and broadcast it in match in their lounges as well. So it's these type of things that becomes available, and that you have your own entity, and not that everyone should, needs to go and handle their own suppliers, things like that, but also that we exchange experiences of what can you do, what is new, what did other people do. Clubs compete very little. That's the thing. That's one of the cultural things. They compete fiercely on grass, but commercially, actually, very little. They own their own regions. They own their own fans. So there's much more sense in those exchanging commercial knowledge than there is keeping it for themselves. The innovation height will be much better if they exchange, and we do have a tradition for that, and that's one of the strengths, and one of the things we also can use. We can optimize the use of match day production. There's nothing like we deliver this for FC Midtjylland and someone else cannot have it. It doesn't matter, because they're not in direct competition. They're much better off sharing knowledge on these things to up their operation.
And as we know, this total revenue isn't kept exclusively by the top flight, like by the Superliga clubs, while about 80 to 85% of the funds stay in the Superliga. The remaining 15 to 20% is funneled into the lower tiers. How exactly is that money redistributed?
I think it's 14.5% to the second tier, and then it's the third and the fourth tiers. It's close to, it's 3% or something like that of total revenue. So that's how it's distributed down there. They in turn have agreed on on their own distribution formula among the clubs down there. It's very simple. In the second tier, they take out 6% for minutes for under 21 players. They take out 6% for common commercial investments in whatever different initiatives, which can be outdoor campaigns, or it can be digital, it can be data, or many other things. But and the rest is distributed down there according to placement in the league. We take up off a very small amount when there's international breaks, to given as a prize for the clubs who wants to play in the international breaks on timings there,
Yeah.
because it's an attractive TV product, but you risk having a player that are not in your team because it's an international break.
And as we know, Klaus, each organization has its own concerns, but the truth is that the relationship between professional leagues and national football associations is often tense. How would you describe the current synergy with the DBU in your case?
It's very good. We have a very good collaboration, and we've had that since two, especially we've always had it. Back in the old days, there was a lot of conflict, a lot of discussions, a lot of. Then we had a big agreement in that was also 17, 18, where the league was given its independence, but due to consensus of what the general framework is for what we decide and what we do not decide, what competences are with us, what competences are with the federation. A lot of the talent development is done in collaboration with the federation. The federation handles the referees. We co-invest in the VAR, and actually our licensing. We make the licensing requirements. That is the competence of the league. We decide what goes into what you must adhere to get a license to play in the top two tiers. But the licensing administration is placed with the federation, so there's arm's length from the league to whomever is giving the license or not give. But we put in what is but basically we control the licensing requirements. But in general, we have a very good collaboration, and after we sort of, and especially after we did an effort to sit down and say how will we actually, can we agree on how all competences are distributed?
Yeah.
So, and we have a common commercial or a common committee for professional club football as well with the federation, where talent development is the major issue. Yeah.
And speaking to The Athletic 3 years ago, you said that you need sustainability and to protect the culture and the communities around football rather than endless growth. How can sustainability be achieved without constant growth?
That's a good question. I don't think it needs to be constant growth, but it needs to be constant development and dialogue. You cannot stand still. I mean, there's a growth issue as well, and as you can hear, it's also our ambition. I don't think we have reached what we could, but I think that stability is the key word. Stability and development at the same time, and I do believe that's more important than constant growth. I think the stability and stability will provide for continuous growth if you can do that. So I think long-term agreements, a long-term CBA with the players union, a long-term media agreement, a long-term agreement with the federation. I think that these are the key issues that need to be there. Long-term strategy for talent development and investment in this. So I think if you can do these and get these things in place, you're in a good place. It will provide you with growth, but more important, it will it's also in today's there are some leagues where the deficit is so high with all clubs, and it's an enormous risk for the system. Normally, football is too big to fail, not as a business, but too big a cultural thing. So no one will let the business fall. But it's a big risk somewhere, and I think to provide stable platforms is absolutely essential, and then take the opportunity of growth when you get it.
And also, how's the protection of the culture and the communities around football? How is it compatible with the MCOs that you have in your domestic league with clubs like Nordsjælland and Brøndby? Because unlike Sweden and Norway, for example, which firmly hold on to the 50+1 rule, Denmark has favored like private investment since the late 80s, which makes me wonder if you consider it to be like crucial to have the leadership of Scandinavian football.
We like to have the leadership of Scandinavian football, but so would the Norwegians and so would the Swedes. So we got, but that's how it should be. Um, First of all, we can never go back to a 50+1. It can't be done. We would have to close down all clubs because ownership would go away. So we would see what we could handle after that. First of all, I think our governance issues are no larger than countries with 50+1 rules. We have had less clubs going into bankruptcy than is the case in countries with a 50+1. So in essence, these different business models that have been in Denmark have worked. Then there's the MCO issue, which I think is crucial for European football to get a hand on and know how to regulate. It has come too far to just say we do not want it. That cannot be done either. I cannot remember the figures, but if you see UEFA's figures of how many MCOs are there, and even if you take it further than that, you close down for MCOs, then investments will just travel via other channels. So I think it's much more important to work with that there is no insider trading, that transfers are valued at actual value, that these are the things. The number of MCOs in Denmark has been quite stable over the last 10 years. Some come and some go away. And most have been, I would say the MCOs have not been less successful than others. FC Midtjylland went from being an MCO to being a single owned club. Now they are actually an MCO because they own a club in Portugal. I think it's about governance and management within these clubs. We've introduced a regulation on a shift in ownership, which is not aimed at preventing a shift in ownership, but is aimed at ensuring the quality of the process of shifting ownership. So we have a set of transparency requirement. What we do is we not prevent shift in ownership. That would be illegal. But what we do is we can take away the license to sign players' contracts. So if there's a shift of more than 30% of ownership, we take away the license to for player contracts until transparency in ownership, and there's a big set of demands of what you have to deliver of documentation. Actually, you have to deliver documentation for what the new owners, for anyone who own more than 5% in. and then that has to match a set of standards. If it doesn't adhere to that, you will not be given your license to sign player contracts back. That's of course a process most shift in ownerships prefer to go through before they make the shift rather than after the shift. So they're, but we can handle the administrative part of it. But that has improved the standard of ownership to the benefit of all owners actually. Because if you want to be an owner of a football club, you want to be an owner of a good business environment and a well-governed business environment, and not a bad one. So in terms, it have actually increased the attractiveness uh, of the clubs as investment objects because it provides a sounder base for the investors to opt into. But yeah, I think that's it. I think it's much more about governance than it's about ownership.
Yeah, yeah. While you argue that banning MCOs is not doable, you consider that it's important to limit the amount of transfers between clubs that share the same investors, and also,
I think that I don't know if you say you have to limit them, but you have to ensure that they are done at the real value, which actually and that's a funny part. It's fun that there hasn't been a tax case somewhere in Europe because it's actually in other companies it's actually illegal. You know, it's called transfer pricing. If you're not selling from one part of a company to another internationally at real price, it's but for some reason. No one's had a look at a football club yet. But I think to ensure that transactions are done at real value is the most important thing of all.
yeah, yeah. No, no, but that's a really interesting point because you mentioned that it should be possible to assess this fair market value,
Yeah.
just like as complex commodities. But looking at the broader business world, how do you practically regulate a market where an asset's value can exponentially increase just few months after being acquired?
Like you would in other markets. You know, it's not the players. Yeah, I have to say that you cannot sell a football player. That's illegal. That's called slave trade. It cannot be done. What you sell is is the company asset you have of a contract that cannot be breached, and you know you sell the value of breaching that contract, but that's a different story. But anyway, but I don't think that's a more complex asset than many other things. So yes, it can be done
But do you have
within.
any examples? Because I know there are a couple, but any that come to your mind, like being a direct link with football players?
No, no, not that comes to my mind. But I remember there are some examples, but I can't remember.
Okay.
But I think UEFA is trying to crack how to do this, and I think that's the right thing, the right thing to do, and to instigate that into the European club competition tournaments, because for better or worse, they're so important for all clubs to be able to access that if you regulate there, it will travel down into international competitions. And then for FIFA, of course, to travel along that road as well and develop, you know, handling the the development of the transfer system is one of the central tasks for the integrity of the game, I think. And I think FIFA has been doing an okay job so far in the processes that they've started. You can criticize FIFA for many things, but in this area, I think that they, they they need to get a bit busy and handle it, UEFA and FIFA. But they are working in the right direction in these issues. My opinion.
You've long advocated because we were mentioning Klaus that we were mentioning sustainability. So you've long advocated for stadium sustainability, not just as a financial goal, but as a real commitment to local communities. Given the specific impact of climate change in some regions, such as Scandinavia, how's this shift already manifesting in Danish football compared to decades ago, if it is actually manifesting? And looking ahead, what concerns you most? Like if the need of any structural changes to infrastructure, a shift toward synthetic turf, or any other subjects, if you have any vision on that.
I think the most important thing is for clubs to get a handle on what makes a difference and what doesn't in this respect. And we're running right now, we're running a project with double value accounting for all clubs, where you take a look into your books and say what will actually make a difference in this respect, in the whole, what do you call it, ESG set. And it can be many different things. It's not likely to be, many has to why are beer mugs not recyclable? It has to be the most important thing of all. If you take a look into the actual impact of it, it could be sensible, but it doesn't make a big impact. Then Danish people have a habit of eating much too much beef, and if they would remove the beef from the lounges, dinner in the lounges, it would make a huge impact. Which is completely ridiculous, but it would. And then there are other issues to be thought through, like if you actually said, Denmark has a vast infrastructure of central heating and centralized heating power plants, or which can be run on all sorts of energy. But heating pitches, if you do that the right way, if you interconnect that with your local power plant, you can actually leverage how the power is used and the heat is used to heat the pitch. So it actually makes the plant more efficient, and in terms you can actually sometimes save energy. So it's things like that, and clubs have to engage. But the most important thing is that clubs do the analysis, that the initiatives they say they make will make a real difference. It will come, because especially because larger sponsors will ask for it. So it's and they will ask for a double value accounting, or an ESG accounting, or what do you do with this and that. So it will impact, and it will come automatically. But for the clubs, they need to be ready to not waste resources on something that looks good but makes little difference.
And Klaus,
But
yeah, go
yeah,
ahead, sir.
no, sorry.
No, no. We were also making some distinctions, right, between like Denmark and other Scandinavian countries for the
Hmm.
50+1 rule and so on. Uh, Also, when we look at VAR, that was inaugurated in the Superliga in 2021, whereas, for instance, Swedish fans block it, and also countries like Finland and Iceland still remain VAR-free zones for different reasons. Whether discussing technology or broader governance, is it vital to adopt recent changes? Or, in your view, is there any hidden value for mid sized and smaller leagues in distinguishing themselves by remaining faithful to football's traditional roots?
I wouldn't speak for other countries, but the Danish tradition is to adopt new developments and being on the forefront of those. Therefore, also VAR, where we had a fairly early adoption compared to our size. Um, we defend tons of traditional values in football, especially the interconnection with the mother club and the local community is extremely strong here as well. It's maintained in another way than it is in a Swedish context, but we a part of our DNA is also to be modern and innovative and compete with the Premier League and the Champions League and not lag behind farther than we have to, because we we do not have the same resources as they do, but to be as close to their innovative to their innovation as we can. That's the way we've chosen and the DNA we have, and whether that's more, I don't know. We've been fairly successful in choosing that route, and it's also what the sporting sector wants. Once you have VAR, just if we took it away, it would take 10 matches to get it back, because the sporting sector would scream for these mistakes not to be made. They're accustomed to lowering the amount of you know of match deciding mistakes in a match.
And when we speak and when we think about mid-sized and smaller leagues, you've argued that while the Champions League relies on mega brands, the Conference League has been a major triumph, as it deeply builds fan identity and brings smaller clubs into Europe, which
Yeah.
ultimately, of course, benefits domestic competitive balance. Do you see this project as a definitive blueprint for UEFA moving forward, or would you suggest other ways to involve the various tiers of clubs and engage friends across all regions?
No, I think the blueprint is there. I have to say, I certainly see no need for expansion. I think the Conference League is a big success. And I think it benefits European football vastly and much more than anyone would have thought. Um, I think there's no room in the calendar for more matches. Now that's for sure. And the exclusive week should go away and make more room in the domestic calendar. Um, but apart from that, I would say all the evaluations points towards that this is for now a very decent blueprint. If it can go anywhere else, maybe it will have to never ever stray from the only way you can qualify to European competitions is through domestic competitions. We cannot, which there will be a bigger pressure from, especially not the very biggest clubs, but the clubs below that. We cannot move towards an increased qualification based on coefficient points from club coefficient points. It cannot happen. We have to maintain the football pyramid. It's the most valuable thing we have in European football.
Like speaking about this, you've openly warned that the expanded Champions League destroys the domestic backbone of football. Since UEFA has been receptive to listening to domestic leagues, unlike FIFA, how do you plan to stop them from monopolizing prime broadcasting slots and further cannibalizing domestic schedules, especially as top clubs across all league sizes constantly push to play more and prioritize European matches? UEFA's payoff is for the good of football, and I'm sure they're serious about it. That would be my answer to that. You have to place your faith in that they will they will govern European football responsibly. In the end, it's not something a league like Denmark have any leverage against. But apart from that, we can have all sorts of public debates and all the rest of it. But I would say that we constantly need to remind UEFA that they are owned by federations. They're owned by grassroots football. They're owned by the organizations that organize domestic club football, which is the backbone of Europe, and they are for the good of football. And this will have to be what carries us all further, in my view. And Klaus, when we speak about UEFA's revenue distribution, you believe it should essentially be about protecting the competitive balance, and thus the funds must end up with the non-participating clubs as well. For that reason, you consider compensation to be more appropriate than solidarity because it's compensation for the value delivered. Ultimately, where would you draw the line when distributing these funds to non-participating clubs should go?
I don't know. It will never get there, but 20% is not an unfair figure. It's not unfair because European club competitions are based on value created in many countries in competitions that have run for over 100 years. That's the basis of the commercial success of the European club competitions. So, but it was a big step forward going up to 7%. That should be defended. Going higher would only be reasonable, but hard to achieve.
Yeah, yeah. Still, another tricky question. How do you prevent the ballooning UEFA prize money, which only a handful of Danish clubs consistently receive, from undermining the competitiveness of the Super League?
It's so far we've been okay. The competitive balance is okay. You can work with competition formats. I believe that investments in talent development is extremely important because that provides everyone with a good basis for that. And then the stability in your domestic commercial agreement, so there is a stable foundation for all clubs to build on. I think this is what you ultimately can do.
Yeah, yeah.
And then we always blessed that for the very top clubs to achieve 5% more cost double compared to compared is double the cost of their budget, whereas smaller clubs need much less money to bite the heels of the big ones, and we should always take care of that.
Now that we are approaching the end of our conversation, just mentioning a couple of subjects, like for instance, 3 years ago, you criticized FIFA's 32 team club World Cup, arguing that
Yeah.
it was bad, it is bad for players and drains value from domestic commercial deals. If even if a couple of Danish clubs actually played in it, would you still be against it, or would you think that it could help Danish football to get more, to get
No,
more
it,
on
it,
top of it?
it, it would not help anything in Danish football. It would help the individual clubs. It's a competition that just takes up more space in the calendar and the market and everything else, and it provides no value.
Yeah. I was wondering about the coefficient, like if those clubs could push a bit higher in the UEFA rankings, but I believe you.
Yeah, but they should do that in playing good UEFA competition matches.
Yeah, yeah. And because 10 years ago you were already warning that catering exclusively to giant clubs would
Yeah,
destroy the promotion and relegation system. So you don't see any kind of positives in this kind of Super League, let's say, project?
no. I think they can go ahead if they will run it outside the regulators and then it'll be a fair and open competition. It can never ever take place within FIFA or UEFA. I don't think it should. I think it has no place there.
Because when you say that it would surprise you that FIFA didn't want to to expand these tournaments beyond summer and beyond their each 4 or 2 year cycle, but then again you also say that you we always have an Eurocentric view on everything, and this is also a risk, right? So this
Yeah.
this was why I was wondering, because you are the first saying that this idea would perfectly fit other markets, okay, like US, Africa, Asia.
I
So
think it will.
so
Yeah.
so why don't you? Is this something
I
that you think about?
but then please do not do it with the assets developed in our domestic competitions. Do it with the regional associations that does this. But it is an Eurocentric. I agree. It's a Eurocentric view to say this. It has a vast amount of relevance in other countries, but develop. It would be better to develop the regional competitions and take care of the pyramid of football instead of making it the franchise competitions football world market.
So even if the Superliga had a more, how can I say, a more positive communication and
Yeah,
had involved more the domestic leagues, you still thought it would be it wouldn't be viable.
I would hope not. Also, it would face fierce competition
Yeah. In what
from
sense you?
domestic from domestic
Ah,
leagues, from the European club competitions, from we would never, if we would never, we would schedule matches where we would have to, and our national teams would have to play the matches where they were scheduled or step out of our tournament.
yeah.
It's a difficult one to see it fly.
Yeah. Because then you say that if there is a global super league, then clubs mirroring other sports would need to pick where to rest their players, right? Like if in the domestic league, international
Yeah,
matches, and so on. Uh,
probably.
so you say that when a league, a domestic league, is evaluated on itself, the value, aggregated value, is higher if we go beyond the top clubs. So basically, it will never be done a super league if we take this premise, or will it?
I don't know. It can be done with global mega brands, but when you go a bit further down, I doubt that there's a big potential for it.
Yeah. So before your last content adjustment, what's the strategy behind Danish women's football?
You should ask the Danish women's league for that.
So you have no any kind of involvement on that.
No, it's an independent organization.
Okay.
It's an independent organization.
You don't even
I could have
communicate
I
with.
could have a view on it, but I will refrain from that. It's becoming a big investment area for our clubs, so it is moving forward rapidly. But
Okay.
you should speak with the women's league about it because it would be inappropriate for me to.
Okay. Okay. So just to finish this chapter, is not something that you communicate often to in terms of strategically speaking and such.
No,
Okay. Okay.
not really. Our clubs engage a lot, and it is developing in a very fine pace, and it's very good and positive. But it's not my area, so I wouldn't give advice.
Okay. Okay,
It would be
understood.
inappropriate.
On a final note, Claus, would you have any recommendations for a book, series, documentary, or film about sports management or football in general?
Uh, that I have never thought about. No, I do not.
Like that, you never like read anything or watch anything that stayed in your back or in sports generally even.
Not that I can think of right now.
Okay, okay, okay. Klaus, once again, thank you so much for the relevant insights throughout the
Thank
conversation.
you very much, Pedro. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. And for those who listen or watching us, you can just subscribe Folha Seca channel on YouTube, or also following Folha Seca on the audio streaming platforms such as Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thanks. Cheers, everyone.
Thank you.